The high desert sun is a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of Isaiah's homestead. For months, it has offered no relief, only a relentless, shimmering heat that steals the life from the ground and the hope from a man's heart. His well, once a promise of survival, is now just a stone-lined throat choked with dust. He stands at its edge, a former buffalo soldier, a man whose back bears the discipline of the army and whose soul bears the scars of a world that has always seen his skin before it saw him. In the nearby town of Redemption, they whisper about him. They say he's proud, stubborn, unhandleable. Matchmakers have sent women, hopeful widows and sturdy farm daughters, 100 by the town's count. They arrived with plans to soften his edges, to manage his land and his life. They left defeated by his silence, his refusal to be molded, his fierce, solitary pride. He isn't looking to be handled. He's looking for water. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. He sees her first as a flicker of motion at the edge of his property, a phantom in the heat haze. She moves not like the townswomen, with their rustling skirts and determined gaits, but like a shadow, her steps silent on the parched ground. She is young, Apache, with eyes that hold the vast, knowing quiet of the desert itself. She carries nothing but a small waterskin and a weariness that Isaiah recognizes, for he wears it himself. He watches, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle leaning against the well, his suspicion a hard knot in his gut. She stops 100 yards away, not looking at him, but at the land, reading it like a page he no longer understood. And with an instinct he couldn't name, a weariness that finally outweighed his pride, he didn't raise the rifle. He just waited. His life, and hers, were about to be irrevocably changed. The silence between them stretched, taut as a wire. Isaiah had seen his share of desperate folk, but this girl, woman, he corrected himself, for there was an ancient stillness in her gaze that belied her years, was different. She wasn't begging, nor was she threatening. She was simply present. Her deerskin dress was worn, her dark hair unbound save for a simple tie, and she carried herself with a straight-backed dignity that felt as natural and unyielding as the saguaro cactus dotting the landscape. He finally broke the quiet, his voice raspy from dust and disuse. "State your business." She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. They were dark, fathomless, and held no fear. "You are looking for water in the wrong place," she said. Her voice was low, softer than he expected, yet it carried across the dry air with perfect clarity. A bitter laugh escaped him. "And I suppose you know the right one." Every so-called expert from Redemption to Tucson had an opinion. Divining rods, dynamite, prayer. None of it had brought forth a single drop. The town saw his failing homestead as proof of his inherent inability, a black man trying to tame a land that God intended for others. The girl didn't react to his sarcasm. She merely gestured with her chin toward a low rise of granite and mesquite a quarter-mile to the east. "The rock weeps there, under the ground. You listen with your feet, not your ears." Isaiah stared at the barren-looking outcrop. He'd walked that ground 100 times, seen nothing but lizards and scrub. Yet, something in her certainty held him. It was the same kind of certainty he'd seen in scouts who could read a day-old track on stone, a certainty born not of books, but of existence. He was a man drowning, and she was pointing to what looked like a mirage. But what did he have to lose? "If you're wrong," he said, the words a low growl, "you'll keep moving." "If I am right," she countered, her voice even, "I will have water for my journey." It was a fair bargain. Grabbing a shovel and a pickaxe, feeling the fool, he strode toward the rise. She followed at a distance, her silence a heavy weight on his shoulders. He felt the eyes of his ancestors, of his former commanding officers, of the gossiping women in town, all watching him follow the lead of a wandering Apache girl. She stopped him at a place that looked no different from any other. It was a shallow basin of baked earth between 3 gnarled mesquite trees. "Here," she said. She knelt, placing her palm flat against the ground, closing her eyes for a long moment. "The earth is cool below. Life." He wanted to scoff, but he was too tired, too thirsty. He spat on his hands, gripped the pickaxe, and swung. The first strike sent a jarring shock up his arms. The ground was like iron. For an hour, he worked, the sun relentless, sweat stinging his eyes. The girl, Nalin, as he learned she was called, sat in the shade of a rock, watching with an unnerving patience. She didn't offer advice or encouragement. She just watched, her presence a silent testament to her claim. He was a foot down when the soil changed. It was still dry, but darker, softer. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. Hope prickled his skin. He abandoned the pickaxe for the shovel, digging with a renewed, desperate energy. 2 feet. 3. The soil was damp now, cool to the touch. He felt at his knees, scooping it with his hands. It was unmistakable. He dug faster, frantically, until his fingers scraped against wet, muddy clay. A few inches more, and a small, dirty puddle began to seep into the bottom of the hole. Isaiah stared at it, his chest heaving. It wasn't a spring, not a gushing river, but it was water. It was life. He looked over at Nalin. She hadn't moved, her expression unchanged. She simply gave a slow, single nod. That night, he offered her a place in his lean-to, a portion of his meager meal of beans and jerky. He didn't know the words for what he felt, a reluctant gratitude, a profound bewilderment. He had spent his life proving he needed no one. He'd built this homestead with his own 2 hands, a defiant act against a world that said he couldn't. And in a single afternoon, this silent, watchful woman had saved it with a knowledge he couldn't begin to comprehend. "The well will be deep," he said, breaking the evening silence. "Hard work. The desert does not give its gifts easily," she replied, her eyes on the fire. "I can pay you for your trouble, for the guidance." She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than calm in her eyes, a deep, resonant weariness. "My people are scattered. My journey has no destination. A place to rest is payment." So began their arrangement. It was a partnership of silence and space. Isaiah rose before dawn, widening and deepening the new well. Nalin would disappear for hours, returning with wild greens he didn't know were edible, or snared rabbits that added precious meat to their table. She showed him how to use the fibrous leaves of the yucca to create cordage stronger than any rope he could buy. She taught him which plants held water in their roots and which berries would settle a fever. He, in turn, offered the protection of his home. He taught her how to sight down the barrel of his rifle, though she handled it with a distaste that told him she preferred her own methods of survival. He repaired her worn moccasins with his army-issued leatherworking tools. They rarely spoke of the past. His was etched into the rigid set of his shoulders, and the way he'd sometimes stare at the horizon, his mind 1,000 miles away on some forgotten battlefield. Hers was in the way she moved across the land as if she were a part of it, a displaced spirit seeking its home. The town of Redemption did not approve. When Isaiah rode in for supplies, the whispers followed him like flies. Old Man Hemlock, the store owner, squinted at him over his spectacles. "Heard you struck water, Isaiah," he said, his tone thick with insinuation. "Heard you had some native help." "The land provides if you know how to ask," Isaiah said, his voice flat, offering no more. "Folks are saying things," Hemlock pressed, leaning over the counter. "A lone man and an Apache woman. It ain't proper." "Sheriff Barlow's been asking questions." Isaiah's jaw tightened. Sheriff Barlow was a man who wore his authority like a shroud, casting a pall of suspicion over anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the world. "My homestead is my business, Hemlock." "Just saying," the owner mumbled, backing away from the cold fire in Isaiah's eyes. 100 good Christian women weren't enough for you. Had to go and find yourself a wild 1 inch. The words were meant to sting, to shame him. But as Isaiah rode back, the heavy sacks of flour and salt tied to his mule, he realized they had the opposite effect. The 100 good Christian women had seen his land as a challenge, his solitude as a flaw, and him as a project. They had wanted to change him, to handle him. Nalin wanted nothing of the sort. She saw the land not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. And he was slowly beginning to realize she saw him in the same way. Their quiet rhythm was tested a month later when a fierce autumn storm rolled in without warning. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the small cabin. Rain came down in solid sheets, turning his dusty yard into a churning river of mud. They worked together in the deluge, Isaiah using his army strength to secure the shutters and brace the door, while Nalin, quick and agile, secured the animals and dug a trench to divert the worst of the flash flood away from the cabin's foundation. Soaked and shivering, they huddled inside as the storm raged. The small room was filled with the roar of the wind and the drumming of rain. A loose board on the roof began to flap violently. Before Isaiah could move, it was torn away, and a torrent of cold water poured into the cabin. He cursed, grabbing a bucket, but it was useless. Then, Nalin was moving. In the dim lantern light, he watched her scale the inside wall, her bare feet finding purchase on the rough-hewn logs. She wedged herself into the rafters, then leaned out into the storm, battling the wind to pull a spare piece of canvas over the hole. She secured it with the yucca cord she had made, her small frame straining against the force of the gale. For a terrifying moment, Isaiah thought the wind would take her, and he started forward, his heart pounding. But she held firm. The flooding slowed to a trickle. When she climbed down, her face was pale, her hair plastered to her skin, but her eyes were bright with fierce determination. He met her at the bottom of the ladder, his hands hovering, unsure what to do. The instinct to touch her, to pull her away from the cold, was overwhelming. It was an instinct he hadn't felt in a decade. "You're freezing," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He stoked the fire, his movements jerky and uncertain. He handed her his driest blanket, a heavy wool one from his army days. She wrapped it around her shoulders, her shivering slowly subsiding. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the storm their only chaperone. "You were a soldier," she stated, not a question. He looked up, surprised. He never spoke of it. "How did you know?" "You move like one," she said. "Always watching the perimeter. Always ready for a fight. But the real fight is inside you." The observation was so direct, so unervingly accurate, it stripped him of his defenses. He found himself telling her things he'd never told another soul. About the meaningless brutality of the campaigns, the hollowness of the commendations, the gnawing loneliness of being a hero to a nation that still saw you as less than a man. He spoke of the 100 women, of how they'd all looked at him with pity or ambition, how they'd tried to fill his silence with their chatter, never understanding that the silence was a sanctuary. When he finished, his throat raw, the fire had burned low. Nalin was watching him, her gaze unwavering. "My village was burned," she said softly, the words dropping into the quiet room like stones into a deep well. "Soldiers did it. They said we were hiding warriors. We were hiding grandmothers and children. I ran. I have been running ever since. I do not run anymore." In that moment, the space between them vanished. He was no longer just a black soldier, and she was no longer just an Apache woman. They were two survivors, two solitary souls who had found a strange, unspoken refuge in each other's presence. The world had tried to break them both, labeling him unhandleable and her savage, but here, in this small cabin, battered by the storm, they were simply Isaiah and Nalin. As the weeks bled into months, the homestead began to transform. The well, now deep and stone-lined, provided clean, cold water. A small garden, laid out and tended by Nalin with plants she'd gathered, flourished with squash and beans. The rhythms of their life became intertwined. They were a team, moving around each other with an economy of motion and an intuitive understanding that required few words. He learned the meaning of her silences, the watchful quiet that meant a hawk was circling, the thoughtful quiet that meant she was considering a problem, the peaceful quiet that meant she was content. He found himself watching her more and more. The way her hands were so deft as she braided a rope or cleaned a fish. The way she would sometimes hum a low, ancient-sounding melody as she worked. The way she would stand at dusk and watch the last light fade from the sky, her face a mask of serene sorrow. He had spent years building walls around his heart, and she had dismantled them without ever seeming to try. She hadn't handled him, she had healed him. The fragile peace was shattered on a cold morning in late fall. Isaiah was repairing a fence on his northern boundary when he saw two riders approaching. One was Sheriff Barlow, his silver star glinting malevolently in the sun. The other was a man Isaiah had never seen, a portly man in a city suit, his face florid with self-importance. "Isaiah," Barlow called out, his voice slick with false congeniality. He reined in his horse, looking pointedly at the mended fence, the healthy-looking cattle, the distant curl of smoke from the cabin chimney. "You're looking mighty prosperous." "I get by," Isaiah said, his hand dropping to rest near the hammer on his belt. "This here is Mr. Davies, from the Territorial Land Office," Barlow said, gesturing to his companion. "He's here about a discrepancy." Davies cleared his throat, avoiding Isaiah's gaze. "It has come to our attention, through certain civic-minded reports, that your claim may be invalid. There are questions about your fulfillment of the homesteading requirements. Specifically, the improvement and civilizing clauses." Isaiah felt a cold rage build in his chest. "I built a cabin. I dug a well. I'm running cattle. This land is improved. A well dug by an unlicensed squatter?" Barlow interjected, his eyes gleaming. "A homestead shared with a transient native? The law is particular, Isaiah. It's meant to encourage proper, family-oriented settlement. Not this." He waved a dismissive hand toward the cabin. "She works for me," Isaiah said, the lie tasting like ash. It wasn't a lie, but it was so much less than the truth. "Is she on your payroll? Did you file the paperwork?" Davies asked, his voice reedy. "Because if not, Sheriff Barlow is within his rights to remove her for vagrancy. And without her, well, it seems your recent prosperity might dry up. The committee might be forced to reconsider your claim in favor of a more stable applicant." The threat was clear. They weren't just after Nalin, they were using her to take his land. It was the same old story, just with new words. They would take everything he had built, and he would be left with nothing but the dust. "You have 1 week," Barlow said, his smile thin and cruel. "1 week to sort this out. Send the Apache packing, and maybe we can forget this whole business." They wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving Isaiah standing in a silence that was no longer peaceful, but filled with the clang of a closing trap. He walked back to the cabin, each step heavier than the last. Nalin was there, grinding corn. She looked up as he entered, and he knew from her eyes that she had seen the riders, that she already understood. "I have to go," she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. "They will take your home." "No," Isaiah said, the word a rock in his throat. He walked over to the small table where she worked. "No, you're not going anywhere. They will not let you be, Isaiah. Not with me here." "Then let them come," he said, and the fire he'd banked for so long roared to life in his veins. The soldier, the fighter, the man who had refused to be broken, was awake. "This isn't just my home anymore, Nalin. It's ours." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a survivor, but the architect of his own survival. He saw the woman who had brought water from stone, food from the dust, and peace to his war-torn soul. The thought of her leaving, of her facing the world alone again, was more terrifying than facing down Barlow and the entire town of Redemption. "There's another way," he said, his voice low and urgent. "A way to make it legal, to make it permanent." She watched him, her dark eyes searching his. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers on the stone grinder. Her hand was so small, yet it held an impossible strength. "The law wants a family," he said. "The town wants things to be proper. We'll give them what they want." He took a breath, the words feeling both insane and more right than anything he had ever said. "Nalin, will you marry me?" It was not a proposal of passion, but of defiance. It was a declaration of alliance, a drawing of a battle line in the dust of their cabin floor. It was his final, unbreachable defense against a world that sought to tear them apart. He was offering her his name, the protection of the law he so despised, because she had already given him back his life. He waited, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, for her answer. She didn't look away, and in the profound quiet of her gaze, he saw not just acceptance, but the reflection of his own fierce, unyielding resolve. The morning they rode into Redemption was clear and cold, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. Isaiah wore his old army dress jacket, the blue wool faded but the buttons polished to a dull gleam. It was the only formal thing he owned, a piece of a past he despised, but a symbol of a legitimacy he now desperately needed. Nalin rode beside him, sitting straight on the mule. She wore a simple dress of traded calico, and her hair was neatly braided, but her face held the same calm, unreadable expression it always did. She looked less like a bride and more like a queen surveying a hostile land. Their arrival turned heads. The usual morning bustle of the town faltered, conversations dying as townsfolk stopped to stare. The sight of the stern black rancher and the silent Apache woman riding side by side toward the justice of the peace was a spectacle no one wanted to miss. Whispers followed them, sharp and stinging as hornets. Shameless. Making a mockery of the institution. Barlow won't stand for it. They dismounted in front of the small office of Judge Miller, a man known more for his timidity than his conviction. Sheriff Barlow was already there, leaning against a post, a smug look on his face. He'd been waiting for them. "Well, now, Isaiah," Barlow drawled, pushing himself off the post. "Don't tell me you're taking my advice. Sending her away?" "No, Sheriff," Isaiah said, his voice level and cold. "We're here to see the judge. We're getting married." Barlow's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark flush of anger. "You can't be serious. That's an abomination. Miller won't do it. The law says he has to," Isaiah stated, his gaze unflinching. "There's no law in this territory says otherwise." He had spent 2 sleepless nights reading the worn book of territorial statutes he owned. He was right. It was unconventional, it was scandalous, but it wasn't illegal. They pushed past the sheriff and into the dusty office. Judge Miller, a small man with watery eyes, looked up from his paperwork, his expression turning to one of pure panic as he saw who his visitors were and the storm gathering at his door. "Judge," Isaiah began, "we need you to perform a marriage ceremony." Miller stammered, his eyes darting toward the doorway where Barlow now stood, flanked by 2 of his cronies. "Now, Isaiah, let's not be hasty. This is highly irregular. The community is not my concern," Isaiah cut in, his voice ringing with authority. "Your duty is. Are you going to perform it? Or am I going to file a complaint with the territorial governor that you are refusing to uphold the law based on prejudice?" The threat hung in the air, potent and dangerous. Barlow stepped forward. "You're not going to threaten the judge, Isaiah." "I'm stating my rights," Isaiah shot back. He turned to Nalin, who had remained silent, her stillness a stark contrast to the men's agitation. Her calm gaze seemed to give him strength. "This woman is my intended. She is a resident of my homestead. We meet all the legal requirements. She's a vagrant." Barlow spat. "She is the reason my homestead has water," Isaiah declared, his voice rising, carrying out into the street where a crowd was gathering. "She is the reason my cattle are fed. She knows this land better than any man in this town. If that makes her a vagrant, then we're all fools." He looked past Barlow, at the faces in the street. Hemlock, the store owner, the women who had once come to his ranch, the farmers and cowboys whose respect he had tried and failed to earn. You all see a black man and an Apache woman. You see something you don't understand, and it frightens you. You call me unhandleable because I will not bend to your expectations. You see her as a savage because she will not bow to your customs. You see us as less than you." He took a step closer to Nalin, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. "What I see," he said, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, "is the strongest, most honorable person I have ever known. She didn't try to handle me. She stood with me, and I will stand with her." A profound silence fell over the room, over the street. Nalin looked up at Isaiah, and for the first time in front of them all, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was a look of pure, unadorned partnership. In that moment, they were not defined by their race or their pasts, but by their unshakable unity. This she had done was not some single act. It was the quiet, patient process of seeing the man behind the walls and showing him that he didn't have to stand alone. Judge Miller, sweating under the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes, looked from Isaiah's resolute face to Barlow's furious one. He swallowed hard. "Sheriff," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "he is right. There is no legal impediment." Barlow's face contorted with rage, but he was beaten. The law, which he so often twisted to his own purposes, was now a shield for the very people he sought to oppress. He had been outmaneuvered, not by force, but by truth and conviction. He turned and stormed out of the office, his deputies trailing behind him like defeated dogs. The ceremony was short, the words stark and simple in the quiet office. When it was over, Isaiah paid the judge, and they walked back out into the sunlight. The crowd was still there, but their expressions had changed. The open hostility had been replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. They had witnessed something they didn't expect, not a sham, but a genuine, powerful bond. As they mounted their animals to ride home, Isaiah looked at Nalin, his wife. The simple gold band he'd bought looked strange and beautiful on her capable hand. The world had not changed. Prejudice still festered in the heart of redemption. Hardship still lay ahead, but everything that mattered had been settled. He reached over, and his hand found hers. She held it tightly. They turned their backs on the town and rode toward the horizon, toward the small homestead that was no longer his or hers, but theirs. The sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time, Isaiah felt the deep, quiet peace of coming home. The sun sets over the high desert, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet. On a small, thriving homestead, a man and a woman work in comfortable silence, securing the livestock for the night. The well, once a symbol of despair, is now the heart of their shared life, its water cool and abundant. He is no longer the unhandleable man, a solitary figure defined by the world's judgment. She is no longer the nameless wanderer, a ghost on the edge of society. Together, they have forged a sanctuary, a place where their worth is measured not by the color of their skin or the customs they follow, but by the strength of their bond and the resilience of their spirits. In the vast, quiet landscape of the West, they have found their own justice and their own home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.